Deep within the labyrinthine Grimstone Caves, Varyn Skeld, the dreaded Bone King, sat upon his throne of bleached bones and jagged stone, his eyes fixed on the glowing runes etched into the cavern walls. Each rune pulsed faintly with a sickly blue light, feeding him the dark magic that had sustained his reign for decades. Yet lately, the glow had dimmed, and a strange, unsettling hum filled the air, a warning that the power binding the runes was fracturing. Whispers of ancient gods long forgotten echoed through the tunnels, their voices seeping into Varyn's mind like a poison. Sorcha Duskrune, Varyn's most loyal advisor and a sorceress with a penchant for forbidden magic, watched the king from the shadows. Her keen eyes noticed the faint tremors in his hands, the slight flicker of doubt that marred his usually unyielding expression. Sorcha had been with Varyn since his rise to power, through countless battles and rituals that had stained the Grimstone Caves with the blood of the foolish and the brave alike. But even she could sense the change. A shift in the air, a crack in the foundations of Varyn's dominion. As Varyn and Sorcha discussed the failing runes, Keldor Nightbane, the king's enforcer, and a formidable warrior with a soul as dark as the caverns themselves, entered the throne chamber. Keldor's face was etched with the scars of 100 battles, each one a testament to his loyalty and brutality. He knelt before Varyn, his eyes flickering toward the dimming runes. "The people grow restless, my king," Keldor reported. "They sense your power waning. The whispers of rebellion grow louder." Varyn's grip tightened on the armrests of his throne, his nails digging into the brittle bone. "Let them whisper," he snarled, his voice echoing like a thunderclap through the chamber. "They do not know the forces I command, the gods that bend to my will. These runes are but a conduit. My power is eternal." Yet even as he spoke, the dimming light flickered again, casting long, wavering shadows that danced mockingly along the walls. Doubt gnawed at him, an unfamiliar and unwelcome guest. Determined to uncover the cause of the failing runes, Varyn, Sorcha and Keldor ventured deeper into the Grimstone Caves, guided by the faint glow of ancient glyphs. The air grew colder, thick with the weight of forgotten sorcery. As they descended, Varyn could feel the runes' energy slipping away, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The path led them to a vast cavern where a massive rune, larger than any Varyn had ever seen, was cracked and flickering. This was the source, a shattering glyph that pulsed with a malevolent force, hinting at something far older and far more dangerous than Varyn's reign. As the trio ventured deeper into the Grimstone Caves, the air grew colder and heavier, thick with the whispers of ancient magic. Varyn led the way, his hand gripping the hilt of his bone-forged sword, its blade faintly glowing with runic power. Sorcha moved carefully, her eyes tracing the fractured glyphs that lined the walls, each crack a reminder of the growing instability in the king's power. Keldor followed silently, his every step calculated, ever watchful for the unseen dangers lurking in the shadows. The deeper they went, the more intense the whispers became, as if the caves themselves were alive and desperate to speak. They reached a vast chamber, larger than any they had seen before. At its centre stood a colossal rune, larger and more intricate than any Varyn had ever encountered. It was ancient, predating even the oldest glyphs that powered his throne. Its surface was cracked, flickering erratically between light and darkness, as if caught in a struggle between life and death. Sorcha approached it cautiously, her fingers tracing the edges of the fractures. "This rune, it's not just failing," she murmured, her voice tinged with a mix of awe and fear. "It's breaking apart from the inside. Something is trying to get out." Varyn's expression hardened. He could feel the power radiating from the shattered glyph, a raw, primal force unlike anything he had harnessed before. This was the source of his kingdom's growing instability, the reason his once unbreakable grip on power was faltering. But as he stared into the heart of the broken rune, he realized it was not a power he could control. It was a force that threatened to consume everything, including himself. The ancient evil trapped within the glyph was awakening, and its hunger for freedom was palpable. Keldor unsheathed his sword, his instincts screaming that this was no ordinary threat. "We should leave," he urged, his eyes fixed on the flickering rune. "This is beyond us, beyond even you, my king. We need to seal this place before whatever is inside breaks free." But Varyn's pride and desperation drove him forward. He was the Bone King, ruler of death and master of runes. He would not be cowed by a relic of the past. Determined to reclaim his power, Varyn began to chant an incantation, his voice echoing through the chamber as he attempted to bind the ancient force to his will. The rune's light flared violently, and a shockwave of dark energy surged through the cavern, knocking Sorcha and Keldor to the ground. Varyn staggered, but he continued his chant, refusing to relent. The cavern trembled as the cracks in the glyph widened, releasing tendrils of shadow that coiled around the king. The power was immense, overwhelming, and entirely uncontrollable. Varyn's eyes widened in horror as he realized too late that he had made a grave miscalculation. The ancient force was not something he could command. It was a being of pure malevolence that sought only to break free and devour all that stood in its path. As Varyn continued to chant, the tendrils of shadow coiling around him tightened, feeding off his desperation and defiance. The entire cavern shuddered as the ancient glyph's power surged uncontrollably, threatening to rip the very fabric of the Grimstone Caves apart. Sorcha and Keldor struggled to rise, their eyes filled with horror as they watched the shadows begin to consume their king. Varyn's voice faltered, his once commanding tone now strained and laced with fear. The rune was no longer a mere conduit. It had become a living entity, feeding on the darkest parts of Varyn's soul. The shadows around Varyn erupted into a violent storm of dark energy, tearing through the cavern like a raging beast unleashed. Sorcha, her instincts sharp, threw up a protective barrier of magic around herself and Keldor, shielding them from the worst of the onslaught. But Varyn was beyond protection. The shadows clawed at his armor, ripping through the runes that had long been his source of strength. Each tear in the runes was a tear in Varyn's soul, exposing the frailty that lay beneath his ironclad rule. Varyn fell to his knees, his crown of bones slipping from his head and shattering on the cavern floor. The shadows twisted around him, dragging him toward the shattered rune at the chamber's center. Desperation flickered in his eyes as he realized the full extent of his folly. The power he had sought to bind was binding him instead, twisting his essence into something monstrous and unrecognizable. The ancient force within the glyph had waited centuries for a host, and now it had found one in the broken king. Sorcha reached out, her magic straining against the overwhelming force of the shadows. "Varyn!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the cavern. But there was no response, only the sound of the ancient rune splintering further as it absorbed Varyn's essence. Keldor, torn between loyalty and survival, took a step forward, his sword blazing with dark fire as he slashed at the encroaching tendrils. For a brief moment, the shadows recoiled, and Varyn's eyes met Sorcha's. There was a flicker of recognition, of the king he once was, before the darkness pulled him under entirely. With a final deafening crack, the rune shattered completely, releasing a wave of dark magic that swept through the cavern like a tidal wave. The ancient force, no longer contained, roared to life, a being of pure malevolence and hunger. The Grimstone Caves quaked violently, walls crumbling and glyphs flickering out as the unleashed power surged into the world above. Varyn Skeld, the Bone King, was no more. He had been consumed, transformed into a vessel for an ancient evil that now threatened to devour everything in its path. The Grimstone Caves continued to quake violently as the unleashed force of ancient malevolence surged through the caverns, consuming everything in its path. Sorcha and Keldor struggled to maintain their footing amid the collapsing walls and erupting shadows. The ancient runes that had once been a source of power flickered and died, their light extinguished by the overwhelming presence of the released entity. Sorcha's protective barrier was all that kept them from being torn apart by the relentless storm of dark energy, but it was weakening with every passing second. Varyn's transformation was complete. His once mighty form was now an unrecognizable vessel of shadow and raw, chaotic magic. The being that had been Varyn Skeld rose from the shattered remnants of the rune, its shape shifting and warping with each pulse of dark power. It was no longer bound by mortal constraints, a twisted amalgamation of king and ancient force with no will of its own but to destroy. The creature turned its gaze on Sorcha and Keldor, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light that spoke of eternal hunger. Sorcha raised her staff, channeling the last of her magic in a desperate attempt to hold back the monstrosity that had once been her king. The protective barrier flared, its light flickering like a dying flame as the shadows clawed at its edges. Keldor, driven by his unwavering loyalty and fierce determination, charged forward, his sword blazing with dark fire as he slashed at the creature. But each strike passed through the shadowy form without effect, as if the blade itself feared to touch the corrupted essence of Varyn Skeld. Realizing they could not defeat what Varyn had become, Sorcha and Keldor made a desperate retreat, narrowly avoiding the tendrils of darkness that lashed out in pursuit. They fled through the collapsing tunnels, their path lit only by the faint glow of dying runes. The Grimstone Caves were falling apart, the ancient magic that had held them together for centuries unravelling in the wake of the shattered glyph. Sorcha's heart ached with the weight of loss, not just of Varyn, but of the kingdom they had built together, now doomed to fall under the wrath of an unbound ancient evil. As they emerged from the caves, the sky above was darkened by unnatural storm clouds, swirling with the same ominous energy that had been unleashed below. The land trembled as the dark force began to spread, its influence seeping into the world beyond the Grimstone Caves. Sorcha and Keldor stood on the edge of the destruction, watching helplessly as the power that had once fueled their king now threatened to consume everything. The fall of the Bone King was complete, but the true reckoning was only beginning. The unleashed ancient force began to spread beyond the Grimstone Caves, corrupting everything it touched. Dark tendrils crept across the land, draining life from the soil and casting an unnatural shadow over the once thriving kingdom. Villages fell silent as the sky darkened, and a chilling wind swept through the streets, carrying the whispers of the ancient entity now free to roam. The people, once loyal to their Bone King, could only watch in terror as the world they knew crumbled around them. Sorcha and Keldor regrouped on the outskirts of the kingdom, battered and haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. They gazed upon the darkened horizon, knowing that the fall of Varyn Skeld had unleashed a force far more dangerous than anything they had ever faced. Sorcha, her once unshakable resolve now tempered by grief, clutched her staff tightly. The magical runes that had guided her for years now felt like cold, empty symbols, reminders of the power that had cost them everything. Keldor, his armour scarred and his spirit weighed down, stood by her side, silent but resolute. Determined not to let Varyn's downfall be the end of their world, Sorcha began researching the ancient texts she had once feared to touch. Hidden among the forbidden scrolls were hints of a ritual, one that could potentially seal the unleashed force back within the earth. It was a desperate gambit, and one that would require immense sacrifice, more than either Sorcha or Keldor was willing to admit. But they knew that without action, the ancient force would consume everything, leaving nothing but shadow in its wake. As they prepared for the ritual, Sorcha and Keldor ventured back to the outskirts of the Grimstone Caves, now an epicenter of darkness and decay. The air was thick with malevolence, and the ground trembled under the weight of the unleashed power. They began the incantations, their voices steady despite the fear clawing at their hearts. The ritual circle glowed faintly, and the ground beneath them shuddered as the magic took hold. Sorcha could feel the ancient force resisting, pushing back against the binding spells, its fury palpable. In a final act of defiance, the shadows surged one last time, lashing out at Sorcha and Keldor with a force that threatened to tear them apart. But they held their ground, pouring every ounce of their remaining strength into the spell. With a deafening roar, the ancient force was pulled back, the shadows retreating into the earth as the binding runes flared brightly one last time. The sky cleared, the wind stilled, and the darkness receded, but the scars of what had been unleashed would remain forever etched into the land. Sorcha and Keldor stood in the aftermath, exhausted but victorious, knowing they had saved their world, though at a cost they would carry for the rest of their lives.